The clatter of Elise's broom hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot to the grand ballroom of the Hotel de Crillon. She had been invisible for 3 years, a shadow in a blue uniform scrubbing away the sins of the Parisian elite. But as she looked up, her heart didn't just skip. It stopped. Standing 10 feet away, flanked by men in razor-sharp suits, was Seo Dae-Hyun, the same man whose silk sheets she had vanished from 3 weeks ago, the same man whose back she had traced in the moonlight, memorized in the ink that marked him as the king of Seoul's underworld. In his hand, held up against the glow of a 1,000-pound crystal chandelier, was a crumpled plastic stick, a pregnancy test, her pregnancy test, the one she had buried at the bottom of a trash bin before fleeing his suite in the dead of night. Dae-Hyun didn't look angry. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prize. He stepped toward her, his expensive cologne cutting through the scent of floor wax, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous vibration that carried to every gossiping socialite in the room. "You ran quite far, Elise, but you left something behind." He placed a hand firmly over her trembling fingers, pinning them against her noticeably rounder belly. "Marry me today, or I'll burn this city down just to find out why you're carrying my heir in a servant's rags." Elise's fingers tightened on the wooden handle of her broom, her knuckles white. Her mind screamed at her to drop everything and sprint for the service exit, to disappear into the Paris metro like she always did when life got too heavy. But the weight of his hand on her stomach, possessive, warm, and terrifyingly steady, made her knees buckle. She remembered that hand. She remembered it gently tilting her chin up in the darkness of the penthouse. She remembered the way his voice had broken when he whispered things he thought she couldn't understand. She looked around the ballroom. The ambassadors were staring. The heiresses were whispering behind their fans. The contrast was almost sick. He was all sharp lines, power, and a billion-euro empire. She was a messy bun, a wrinkled apron, and a bank account with 12 euros in it. "You shouldn't be here, CEO," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm just a staff. I'm invisible." Dae-Hyun's lips twitched into a cold, haunting smile. "I looked for my invisible girl for 21 days, Elise. I Googled the cleaning rosters of every 5-star hotel in France. I looked at photos of you scrubbing floors while carrying the future of the Seo bloodline." His jaw tightened, the faint scar on his cheek catching the light. "Did you really think I'd let my child grow up in the shadows? Did you think I'd let you disappear? I had a plan." Elise hissed, frustration finally bubbling over her fear. "I was going to move to the suburbs, change my name, start over where men like you couldn't find me." Dae-Hyun held the test higher, the 2 pink lines mocking her. The humor, if there ever was any, drained from his face. "Then explain this," he commanded. Elise felt the blood drain from her face. It was a mistake. I was panicking. I took it before I left your room, and I didn't even check the result. I just threw it away because I was scared of you. I saw the men at that summit. I saw the way they looked at you like you were death himself. The word positive hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Elise grabbed the edge of a gold leaf table to steady herself. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was a cleaner. She was the girl who stayed in the background. She definitely wasn't supposed to be the woman who brought the most dangerous man in Asia to his knees in the middle of a Parisian gala. "It's not just a mistake anymore, Elise," Dae-Hyun said, stepping into her personal space until she could smell the smoke and rain on his coat. "It's a claim. Now, put down the broom. Your life as a ghost ended the second I saw those 2 lines." The transition was so sudden it felt like a fever dream. One moment, Elise was clutching a splintered wooden broom in a drafty Parisian ballroom. The next, she was being ushered into the back of a black obsidian limousine that smelled of expensive leather and cold intentions. Outside the window, the Eiffel Tower blurred into a streak of iron and light as the city she had tried to hide and vanished in the rear-view mirror. Seo Dae-Hyun sat across from her, his presence consuming the oxygen in the vehicle. He didn't speak. He simply watched her with the intensity of a man who had finally recovered a lost treasure and was now deciding where to store it. When they reached the private airfield, a Gulfstream jet stood waiting, its engines humming a low, predatory growl. As she stepped onto the plush cream carpet of the aircraft, the sheer decadence of it made Elise feel physically ill. Only hours ago, She had been rationing her coin for a bus ticket to the suburbs. Now, a flight attendant in a silk scarf offered her vintage champagne on a silver tray. She looked down at her hands. Her nails were short and unpolished, her skin still smelling faintly of the lemon-scented bleach she had used to scrub the hotel floors. She hid them in the folds of her blue uniform, feeling like a stain on the perfection of the cabin. "Eat!" Dae-Hyun commanded softly, gesturing to a spread of Wagyu beef and delicate truffles. "I'm not hungry," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside. "The child needs it, even if you think you don't," he countered. His voice wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of an empire that did not take no for an answer. The flight to Seoul was a blur of high-altitude silence. When they finally touched down and moved into his private estate, the gilded cage truly revealed itself. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and marble perched high above the neon veins of the city. Dae-Hyun led her to a master suite that was larger than her entire apartment in Paris. Elise stood at the edge of the bed, staring at the sheets. They were 1,000 thread count Egyptian silk, so white and smooth they looked like a sheet of untouched snow. She thought of her mattress back home, the one that dipped in the middle and was covered in a scratchy wool blanket she bought at a flea market. She reached out and touched the silk. It felt cold, expensive, and utterly foreign. "This is your room," Dae-Hyun said from the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the dark, swirling ink of a dragon's tail creeping up his neck. "My doctors will be here in the morning. Everything you need is in the dressing room. Throw that uniform away. Elise, you aren't a servant here." "I don't know how to be anything else," she admitted, her voice cracking. He walked toward her, stopping only when the tips of his handmade Italian shoes touched her worn-out work flats. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that terrified her more than his anger ever could. "Then I will teach you," he murmured. "But understand this. The doors are locked, the guards are loyal to me, and the world believes you are my wife. You ran once. If you try it again, there won't be a corner of this earth dark enough to hide you." When he left, the click of the door sounded like a gavel. Elise sank onto the edge of the silk bed, clutching her stomach. She was surrounded by billions of won, protected by an army of men and draped in luxury. But as she looked at the heavy gold handles of the balcony doors, she realized the truth. The broom was gone, but the shackles had simply been dipped in gold. The morning sun in Seoul didn't rise so much as it cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, sharp and clinical. Elise stood by the window, her hands clasped tightly over her stomach, watching the city wake up far below. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. She had been stripped of her blue cleaner's uniform and dressed in a robe of heavy ivory silk that cost more than a year of her previous wages. But the luxury felt like a brand. The sound of a heavy door clicking shut announced Dae-Hyun's arrival. He walked into the room, already dressed in a charcoal suit that screamed authority. He didn't look like a man who had slept. He looked like a general preparing for a siege. He placed a thick folder bound in black leather on the glass table between them. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. Elise obeyed, the silk of her robe whispering against the chair. "I want to go home, Dae-Hyun. I don't belong in this world. I'm a cleaner. I scrub floors. I don't know how to play whatever game this is." "You stopped being a cleaner the moment that test turned positive," Dae-Hyun said, his voice cold and precise. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You think I tracked you across continents because of a one-night whim? My organization, the CEO Syndicate, is built on blood and legacy. Right now, my board of directors and the rival families are circling like vultures. They think I'm vulnerable because I have no direct heir. They think they can wait for me to die or be stepped down so they can tear this empire apart." He tapped the leather folder. "This child changes everything. An heir solidifies my claim. It silences the dissenters. In the eyes of my world, a man with a son is a man with a future. And you, Elise, are the vessel for that future." Elise flinched at the word vessel. "So I'm just a political tool? A piece of property?" "You are my wife," he corrected, his jaw tightening. "Or you will be. This is a contract of blood. The terms are simple. You will marry me legally and remain in this house until the child is born. You will attend every social function, every gala, and every dinner by my side. You will play the role of the devoted woman I fell for in Paris. In exchange, you will receive a level of protection no army on earth can provide. Your debts in France are already gone. Your family's safety is guaranteed. And when the child is of age, you'll be settled with enough wealth to buy any city you choose. And if I refuse? Elise challenged, though her voice betrayed her. Dae-Hyun stood up, walking around the table until he was inches from her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a terrifying reminder of the night that had started this chaos. If you refuse, my enemies will find you within 48 hours. They won't see you as a woman. They will see you as a weakness to be eliminated. They will kill you just to hurt me. Choosing me isn't about luxury, Elise. It's about survival. You carry the Seo crown now. You can either wear it or it will crush you. He slid a fountain pen across the table. The gold nib glinted in the harsh soul light. Elise looked at the document, the fine print blurred by the tears she refused to let fall. She realized then that the marry me from the ballroom hadn't been a proposal. It had been an arrest warrant. With a trembling hand, she reached for the pen, signing away her name to the man who had turned her life into a gilded war zone. The heavy double-oak doors of the private dining hall swung open, revealing a room that felt less like a celebration and more like a tribunal. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey, but beneath it lay the sharp, metallic tang of suppressed hostility. Elise felt Dae-Hyun's hand slide to the small of her back, a gesture that was ostensibly supportive but felt like a warning to stay close. She was wearing a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her growing curves, but she still felt like the girl with the broom, walking into a den of wolves. At the head of the long, obsidian table sat the elders, men whose faces were maps of scars and cold pragmatism. They were the architects of the CEO syndicate, and to them, Elise was an anomaly, a breach in their carefully guarded bloodlines. So, began Elder Park, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering on pavement. He didn't look at Elise. He looked at Dae-Hyun. This is the treasure you found in the gutters of Paris. I expected a princess from a rival clan, or at least a woman whose lineage we could trace back further than Hotel Perrault. The table erupted into low, mocking chuckles. A woman sitting to the left, dressed in sharp silk and dripping in diamonds, leaned forward. I heard she specializes in removing stains. Perhaps she can start with her own reputation. Tell us, dear, did you learn to trap a CEO by scrubbing his floors, or was it the service elevator where you did your best work? Elise's face burned, the heat of the insult prickling behind her eyes. She felt the urge to run, the familiar, desperate instinct to vanish into the shadows where no one could see her shame. But before she could even draw a breath to defend herself, the temperature in the room plummeted. The sound of Dae-Hyun's crystal glass hitting the table wasn't loud, but it silenced the room instantly. He didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He simply leaned back, his eyes turning into shards of black ice as he looked at the woman who had spoken. Mina, Dae-Hyun said, his voice a low, terrifying silk. You are a guest at my table because your father was a loyal man. Do not mistake my hospitality for patience. He turned his gaze to Elder Park, and the silence became suffocating. You speak of gutters and payrolls, yet you forget that the CEO empire was built by men who took what they wanted from a world that gave them nothing. Elise is not a treasure, I found. She is the mother of the next king of the syndicate. Suddenly, Dae-Hyun reached out and grabbed a steak knife from the table. With a blurred, violent precision, he drove the blade through the linen tablecloth, pinning Elder Park's silk sleeve to the wood. The elder gasped frozen, as the tip of the knife missed his skin by a fraction of an inch. The next person who speaks of my wife as a servant will find out how I treat those who insult my blood, Dae-Hyun whispered, leaning in until he was inches from Park's face. She is a CEO now. Her hands may have scrubbed floors, but yours are about to be scrubbed from the history of this organization if you breathe her name with anything less than absolute reverence. Do I make myself clear? The elder nodded frantically, his face pale. Dae-Hyun pulled the knife from the table with a sharp thwack and returned to his meal as if nothing had happened. He reached under the table, finding Elise's trembling hand and squeezing it with fierce, possessive grip. In that moment, Elise realized a terrifying truth. She was safe in the world, but she was now bound to a man who would kill the world to keep her. The violent echoes of the dinner party had faded, replaced by the heavy, pressurized silence of the penthouse library. Outside, the neon lights of Seoul pulsed like a digital heartbeat, but inside, the only light came from the amber glow of the fireplace. Elise stood by the hearth, her fingers tracing the edge of the marble mantelpiece. She was still shaking, the image of the steak knife pinned to the elder's sleeve burned into her retinas. Dae-Hyun moved behind her, his footsteps silent on the silk rug. He didn't touch her, but his heat radiated against her back. "You didn't eat," he noted. His voice no longer the jagged blade he had used on the elders, but something softer, almost weary. "How could I?" Elise turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Dae-Hyun, why are you doing this? You could have had any woman in the world to provide an heir. Someone who knows how to navigate those sharks. Someone who doesn't come with the stain of a service uniform." Dae-Hyun looked into the fire, the flames dancing in the dark pupils of his eyes. "You think Paris was an accident. You think I walked into that hotel bar and saw just another girl." He stepped closer, finally closing the distance. He reached out, his hand hovering before he gently ran a finger over the name tag area of her robe, where her uniform used to be. "I had been watching you for 3 days before I ever spoke to you." Elise's breath hitched. "What?" "I saw you in the lobby," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I watched you handle a rude guest with more grace than any diplomat I've ever employed. You were invisible to everyone else, Elise, but to me, you were the only thing in that hotel that wasn't wearing a mask. You were real, and in my world, real is the rarest commodity there is." The flash of memory hit Elise then, the way he had looked at her across the smoky bar in Paris. She had thought it was just lust, a predator spotting prey. But as he spoke, she saw the truth in the way his jaw softened. "That night wasn't a mistake. It wasn't transaction," Dae-Hyun continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration. "I didn't leave the pregnancy test in your trash for you to find. I left it as a test for myself, to see if I could let you go. But when I found out you had run, I realized I couldn't. It wasn't just about the child, Elise. It was about the way you looked at me before the world found out who I was. You looked at me like I was just a man." He reached out, his large hand cupping the side of her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I didn't bring you here to be a servant or a vessel. I brought you here because I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who want my crown. You're the only one who ever wanted a man beneath it." Elise felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it was a terrifying, magnetic pull toward a monster standing before her. For the first time, she didn't see the Mafia CEO or the ghost of Seoul. She saw a man who was just as lonely as the girl who used to scrub his floors. "It wasn't just a night for me either," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Dae-Hyun leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Then stop trying to run. Elise, the cage is gold. Yes, but I'm in here with you." The following afternoon, the fragile piece of the library was shattered by a presence that felt like a cold draft through a tomb. Dae-Hyun had been called away to the docks, leaving Elise under the watchful, silent eyes of the house security. She was attempting to find comfort in a book when the double doors were flung open by a woman who looked like a sharper, deadlier reflection of Dae-Hyun himself. Seo Hannah, Dae-Hyun's older sister, didn't walk into the room. She invaded it. She was dressed in a suit of blood-red silk, her heels clicking against the marble with the precision of a metronome. Behind her followed 2 assistants carrying a sleek, silver briefcase. Elise stood instinctively, her hand moving to cover her stomach, a gesture of protection that didn't go unnoticed by Hannah's predatory eyes. "So, the little French mouse has finally emerged from the walls," Hannah said, her voice a polished blade. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. She glided to the center of the room and gestured for the briefcase to be placed on the table. "You've caused quite a stir, Elise. My brother has spent a fortune and spilled a fair amount of blood to bring a cleaner into our family tree. It's a sentimental play, and sentiment is a luxury our empire cannot afford. Elise felt the old familiar sting of being looked at as a nuisance rather than a person. I didn't ask for any of this, Ms. Seo. I was perfectly happy being invisible. Were you? Or were you just waiting for a high-value target to stumble into your sights? Hannah's smile was devoid of warmth. She snapped her fingers, and the assistant clicked the briefcase open. Inside, stacked in neat, suffocating bricks, was more cash than Elise had seen in her entire life. Next to the money lay a single, nondescript business card for a private medical clinic in Switzerland. Dae-Hyun wants an heir to secure his throne, Hannah continued, leaning over the table. But an heir with your blood is a liability. It makes him soft. It makes him targetable. This briefcase contains 5 million euros. It's enough to buy you a new life, a new name, and a villa anywhere in the world where the CO name doesn't reach. Elise looked at the money, then at the card for the clinic. The implication was as clear as it was grotesque. The appointment is for tomorrow morning, Hannah whispered, her eyes dark with ambition. A simple procedure. You lose the burden, you take the money, and you disappear back into the shadows you claim to love so much. If you stay, you are just a target. If you leave now, you are a rich woman with her freedom. Elise felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She looked at the stacks of cash, the price Hannah had placed on the life growing inside her. For a moment, the fear of the mafia world almost convinced her. She could run. She could finally be free of the dark romance and the constant threat of death. But then she remembered Dae-Hyun's face in the firelight. She remembered the way he had defended her against the elders. She looked Hannah dead in the eye, her posture straightening with newfound defiance. You're right. I used to be a cleaner, Elise said, her voice low and steady. And one thing I learned is how to spot trash when it walks into a room. Take your money and your assistance and get out of my home. Hannah's face contorted, the mask of elegance slipping to reveal the viper beneath. Your home? You're a guest in a cage, girl. And cages can be crushed. Then let him be the one to crush it, Elise countered. Because I'm not going anywhere. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 6, where the first cracks in Dae-Hyun's cold exterior begin to show during a moment of vulnerability? The stress of the encounter with Hannah lingered like a toxin in Elise's system, manifest in a sharp, sudden cramp that stole her breath and sent her staggering against the edge of the mahogany desk. By the time the sun began to set, a dull, terrifying ache had settled deep in her abdomen. When she looked down and saw the first drop of blood against the white silk of her robe, the world tilted. She didn't call for a maid. She screamed for the only person who held the power of life and death in this house. Seo Dae-Hyun was in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting. A map of global shipping routes spread before him as he prepared to dismantle a rival supply chain. When his personal phone vibrated with the emergency signal from Elise's suite, he didn't excuse himself. He simply stood up, shoved his chair back with a violence that made it topple, and walked out of the room, without a single word to the stunned directors. He reached the penthouse in record time, his lungs burning. He found Elise curled on the bathroom floor, her face as pale as the marble she rested on. In that moment, the ghost of Seoul, the man who had looked at death 1,000 times without blinking, felt his hands begin to shake. Elise, he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. He didn't care about the blood staining his custom-tailored trousers. He scooped her into his arms, his movements frantic yet strangely delicate, as if she were made of spun glass. Stay with me. Look at me, Elise. I'm sorry, she sobbed, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. I'm so sorry, Dae-Hyun. Don't apologize. Just breathe, he commanded, but his voice lacked its usual steel. It was raw, cracked with a vulnerability that would have horrified his subordinates. The private medical wing of the estate became a blur of sterile lights and the hushed, urgent whispers of doctors. Dae-Hyun refused to leave the room. He stood in the corner like a dark sentinel, his eyes fixed on the monitor, when the rhythmic, galloping sound of the fetal heartbeat finally filled the room. Steady and strong, he let out a breath so ragged it sounded like a sob. The doctor turned to him, bowing low. It was a warning, sir. Extreme stress. She needs absolute rest, or the next time we may not be so lucky. Once the room was cleared, a heavy silence settled between them. Elise lay in the high-tech hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the white sheets. Dae-Hyun sat in the chair beside her, his head bowed, his elbows resting on his knees. The untouchable Seo looked defeated. "You left your meeting," Elise whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Dae-Hyun took her hand, his large palm engulfing hers. He didn't look up, but he pressed her knuckles against his forehead. Meetings can be rescheduled. Empires can be rebuilt. But this... He trailed off, his voice thick. "If I lost this, if I lost you, none of the rest would matter." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, the mask was gone. His eyes were red-rimmed, filled with desperate, protective fear that no contract could ever dictate. "Hannah came here, didn't she?" I saw the security footage. His grip tightened, not in anger at Elise, but in a vow to the world. "I promised you protection, and I failed. It will never happen again. From this moment on, you are not just my wife by law. You are my life. And I will burn anyone who breathes the same air as you if they mean you harm." The sky over Seoul was a bruised purple, the kind of heavy, dramatic twilight that preceded a storm. Elise stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the penthouse, barely recognizing the woman staring back. She was draped in a custom-made gown of ivory lace and silk, the fabric expertly draped to accommodate the slight but unmistakable curve of her stomach. A veil of French tulle trailed behind her, light as a cobweb, but as she looked at her reflection, she felt as though she were being wrapped in a shroud. There were no flowers in the hallways, only men in earpieces. There was no music, only the low hum of encrypted radios. This was the wedding of shadows. Dae-Hyun entered the room, his presence hitting her like a physical force. He was dressed in a traditional black tuxedo, looking more like a king than a CEO, and certainly more like a god of war than a groom. He stopped behind her, his eyes meeting hers in the glass. He reached out, his gloved hand resting on her shoulder. "The perimeter is secure," he said, his voice a low rasp. "My men are on every rooftop within 3 blocks. The snipers have a clear line of sight on anyone who approaches the chapel. You are safe, Elise." "Safe," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Is that what we're calling this? A ceremony protected by high-caliber rifles?" Dae-Hyun turned her around, his hands gripping her upper arms with a firm, desperate intensity. "In my world, this is the highest form of devotion I can offer. Every man with a scope out, there is a vow that nothing will touch you. Every bullet in their magazines is a promise to our child." He led her out to the waiting motorcade, a line of armored black SUVs that tore through the city like a funeral procession. The chapel was a private, ancient stone structure tucked away in the hills, lit by 1,000 flickering candles. It was beautiful, haunting, and utterly isolated. As Elise walked down the short aisle, she didn't look at the few invited guests, mostly stony-faced lieutenants and a few terrified diplomats. She looked up at the high, narrow windows. She knew that behind the stained glass, red laser dots were dancing across the courtyard, painting a warning on the chest of anyone who moved too fast. The ceremony was a blur of ancient vows and cold steel. When the priest asked for the rings, Dae-Hyun took her hand. His fingers were steady, but as he slid the heavy diamond band onto her finger, Elise felt his hand tremble, just a fraction, a micro-tremor of raw emotion that no one else would see. "With this," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with ferocity that made her heart race, "I bind my life to yours, my blood to your blood, my empire to your protection." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Every creak of the old wood, every flicker of a candle, made Elise flinch, waiting for the sound of a gunshot to shatter the sanctity of the moment. It was a wedding built on the edge of a blade, a union where love was inseparable from duty, and a kiss was a pact of war. When Dae-Hyun leaned in to seal the vow, his lips were warm and firm. For a fleeting second, the snipers on the roof and the vipers in the pews vanished. There was only the scent of his cologne and the frantic beating of two hearts that had found each other in the dark. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. "You are mine now," he whispered against her skin. "And God help anyone who tries to take you back." The wedding night did not conclude with the fanfare of a celebration, but with the heavy, exhausted silence of two survivors retreating to their bunker. Back in the penthouse, The air was cool and smelled of rain. Elise sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, the heavy lace of her gown feeling like armor she was finally ready to shed. Across the room, Dae-Hyun stood by a window, his back to her, silhouetted against the electric sprawl of Seoul. The silence was broken by the rhythmic sound of the zipper. Elise struggled with the back of her dress, her fingers fumbling against the intricate silk. Without a word, Dae-Hyun crossed the room. His hands, still warm from the day's tension, replaced hers. As the gown loosened and fell away, he didn't pull her closer. Instead, he turned away to remove his own jacket and shirt, his movements slow and deliberate. In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, Elise saw it properly for the first time. His back was a tapestry of violence and art. Dark, swirling ink. The great dragon of the Seo syndicate scaled his spine, but the ink couldn't hide the jagged, pale lines that cut across his skin. There was a particularly brutal scar, a thick rope of raised flesh that ran from his shoulder blade down to his waist. It looked like a map of a war he had barely won. "Dae-Hyun," she whispered, her hand rising instinctively. She stopped herself just inches from his skin. "Who did that to you?" He remained still for a long beat, the muscles in his back tensed. Then he turned slightly, the light catching the sharp line of his jaw. "My father was not a man of sentiment," he said, his voice a low, hollow vibration. "He believed that a successor should be forged in fire. He used to say that if I couldn't survive him, I wouldn't survive the world." He sat on the edge of the bed, the dragon on his back, seeming to ride in the shadows. "When I was 19, he decided my mother was a liability. She was a woman of peace, someone who, like you, never asked for this life. He was going to discard her to send a message to his rivals, to prove he had no heart left to strike." Dae-Hyun's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I didn't take the throne because I wanted the power, Elise. I took it because it was the only way to get her out. I challenged him, broke him, and sent her to a place where his name couldn't reach. Every scar you see was the price of her freedom." Elise moved closer, her heart aching with sudden, sharp clarity. She finally understood why he was so obsessed with protection, why he held the pregnancy test like a verdict, and why he looked at her with such terrifying possessiveness. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man who had traded his soul to save the only person he ever loved, and now he was doing it all over again for her. She reached out, her fingers finally making contact with the jagged ridge of the long scar on his back. He flinched at the touch, a small, human reaction, but he didn't pull away. "You aren't your father," she murmured, leaning her forehead against his shoulder. "You saved her, and you're saving us." Dae-Hyun turned fully then, his eyes dark and shimmering with emotion he usually kept buried under layers of ice. He reached out, cupping her face, his thumb brushing the line of her lips. "I spent my life making sure no one could ever hurt her again. Now, I have 2 more lives to carry. I am a monster to the world, Elise, but I will be a shield for you until my last breath." In the quiet of the room, the ghost of Seoul leaned in and kissed her, not with the dominance of a CEO, but with the desperate, raw hunger of a man who had finally found home. The summit was held in a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Han River, a neutral ground where the city's most dangerous power brokers met to carve up the map of the underworld. Dae-Hyun had insisted Elise attend, not as a guest, but as his wife, a silent statement of his consolidated power. She sat in a plush waiting lounge adjacent to the main boardroom, her fingers tracing the lace of her maternity dress, feeling the familiar hum of anxiety that always preceded a storm. As the hours dragged on, the air in the lounge grew stifling. Craving air and the anonymity of her old life, Elise slipped away from her security detail, moving through the service corridors with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years navigating the invisible veins of luxury buildings. She knew exactly how to walk without making a sound, how to blend into the shadows of a linen closet, and how to look like she belonged in the places where people were meant to be overlooked. She found herself in a narrow maintenance pantry that shared a thin ventilation grate with a private smoking room. She had intended only to catch her breath, but the voices drifting through the vent made her blood run cold. Dae-Hyun is distracted. A voice hissed. It was Elder Park, the man Dae-Hyun had pinned to the table weeks prior. He thinks he's built a fortress around that French girl. He doesn't realize he's just given us a single, concentrated target. The hit happens tonight, a second voice replied, smooth and oily. Elise recognized it as the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate. During the departure, we don't need to kill him yet. We take the woman and the child. A king without an heir is just a man waiting for a grave. Once she's in our hands, Dae-Hyun will sign over the shipping docks just to see her breathe again. Elise pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't a soldier or a strategist, but she understood the mechanics of a clean job. They weren't going to attack the summit. They were going to strike at the moment of transition, the exact second they moved from the lobby to the armored cars. She realized then that her invisible status was no longer a curse. It was the only weapon they hadn't accounted for. They saw her as a trophy, a weakness, a vessel. They didn't see the woman who had spent years observing the habits of the powerful from the corners of their rooms. She didn't run for the exit. Instead, she navigated back through the service tunnels, her mind racing. She reached the main boardroom just as the heavy doors opened and the delegates began to spill out. Dae-Hyun emerged, looking weary and lethal, his eyes instantly searching the room until they landed on her. He moved toward her, his hand reaching for the small of her back. "Are you ready to go?" he asked, his voice low. Elise leaned in, as if to fix his tie, her lips brushing his ear in a mock gesture of affection that masked the urgency of her words. "Don't go to the main entrance," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Park in the dragons. They're waiting at the cars. They don't want you, Dae-Hyun. They're coming for the baby." She felt the muscles in his chest turn to stone. He didn't flinch, didn't look around, didn't give a single sign that the world had just shifted on its axis. He simply looked into her eyes, seeing the clarity and the terror there, and realized that his French mouse had just saved his empire. The evacuation from the summit was supposed to be a surgical redirection, but the Golden Dragon Syndicate had anticipated Dae-Hyun's intuition. As they bypassed the main lobby for service elevators, the power to the building flickered and died, plunging the steel and glass corridor into a terrifying, pressurized darkness. In the chaos of the emergency sirens, a flashbang grenade blinded the security detail. Elise felt a pair of gloved hands tear her away from Dae-Hyun's side. She screamed his name, but the sound was swallowed by the sudden roar of a high-powered motorcycle engine as she was shoved into the back of a nondescript van. Hours later, the blindfold was ripped from her eyes. She was in a derelict industrial kitchen on the outskirts of Incheon, a place of rusted stainless steel and a lingering, sour smell of grease. Across from her, a man with a jagged burn across his jaw sat on a crate, recording a video on his phone. "The ghost of Seoul is currently tearing the city apart to find you, little mouse," he sneered, glancing at the camera. "He's heading straight for the docks where we left a trail of breadcrumbs. He'll walk into kill zone thinking he's saving his heir, and by the time he realizes the trap, he'll be dead, and you'll be on a ship to Shanghai." Elise looked around the kitchen. To the kidnappers, she was a fragile prize, a vessel whose only value was her womb. They had tied her hands loosely to a plumbing pipe, assuming a pregnant cleaner posed no threat. They didn't realize that for Elise, a kitchen was not just a room. It was a workspace where she knew every hidden danger. As the man turned his back to consult with a guard at the door, Elise felt the pipe behind her. It was old, the joints corroded by years of neglect. She didn't struggle against the rope. Instead, she used her feet to hook a heavy industrial degreaser bottle from a nearby shelf, dragging it silently across the floor. She remembered the chemistry of her old life, the things you never mix. With a sharp, desperate tug, she used the leverage of her body weight to snap the rusted bracket of the pipe. Water hissed out, scalding in high pressure. As the guard turned in shock, Elise kicked the bottle of concentrated ammonia she had uncapped into the puddle of bleach-based cleaner on the floor. "What are you doing, you crazy?" the man began, but he didn't finish. The chemical reaction hit the air instantly, a stinging, toxic cloud of chloramine gas rising between them. The kidnappers began to cough, their eyes streaming, clutching their throats as the invisible vapor burned their lungs. Elise, knowing the way of the gas, dropped to the floor where the air was clearest, pulling her shirt over her nose. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from a hanging rack and, with a strength fueled by the primitive instinct to protect her child, swung it at the legs of the man with the phone. He went down with a sickening crack. Elise didn't wait to see if he got up. She scrambled through the thick mist toward the service exit she had spotted earlier, her mind racing. She wasn't just running anymore. She was hunting for a way back to Dae-Hyun. As she burst through the door into the cold night air, she saw the distant glow of the city. She had been an invisible girl for too long. Now, she was the one setting the fire. The restraint that had defined Seo Dae-Hyun since Paris didn't just snap. It evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum of pure, unadulterated carnage. In the heart of Seoul, the ghost became a hurricane. He didn't wait for police reports or ransom calls. He moved through the city's concrete veins like a shadow made of obsidian and cold fire. Every contact he had ever bought, every debt he had ever held over the heads of the city's elite, was called in within 30 minutes of the abduction. Find her, he had roared at his lieutenants. His voice vibrated with a frequency that made even his most hardened soldiers tremble. If there is so much as a scratch on her, I will not stop until the city forgets the name of the Golden Dragon. I will salt the earth where they stood. He personally led the raid on the docks, a location he knew was a decoy, but one he used to send a message. He moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency, his silenced, pistol-spitting lead into the dark. He wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking for blood. When he reached the rival syndicate sub-boss, he didn't ask for a location. He broke the man's fingers one by one until Nae Min-chan was gassed out through a mouthful of blood. Dae-Hyun drove the lead car himself, the engine of the armored SUV screaming as he tore through the night toward the industrial outskirts. His mind was a chaotic loop of Elise's face. The way she looked when she was sleeping, the way her hand felt protecting their child. The thought of her in the hands of men who saw her as a bargaining chip turned his blood to liquid nitrogen. He had spent his life protecting his mother, but this was different. This was his heart, his legacy, and his future all wrapped in one fragile, brave woman. When he reached the abandoned kitchen, he didn't wait for his tactical team to stack up. He kicked the heavy metal door off its hinges with strength fueled by desperation. The scene that greeted him was not the one he had feared. He expected to find Elise broken or bound. Instead, he found a room filled with thick, stinging chemical fog and 3 grown men incapacitated, clawing at their throats on the floor. In the center of the chaos stood Elise, clutching a heavy iron skillet, her hair wild and her eyes burning with fierce maternal fire. Dae-Hyun froze. The monster he had unleashed, the one ready to burn the world, stilled at the sight of her. He dropped his weapon, ignoring the toxic sting in the air, and lunged across the room. "Elise!" he choked out, his voice breaking for the first time in 10 years. He collided with her, his arms wrapping around her so tightly it was as if he were trying to pull her inside his own chest. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of lemon cleaner and copper, his body shaking with a violent, terrifying relief. "I'm here," she whispered, her hands shaking as she dropped the skillet and gripped the back of his tactical vest. "I'm here. We're safe." Dae-Hyun pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face with a frantic possessiveness. He looked at the men groaning on the floor, then back at his wife. A dark, prideful smile touched his lips, even to the tears in his eyes. He had come to save a victim, but he had found a queen. He realized then that he hadn't just protected her. She had become the only thing capable of saving him from himself. The first snow of the season was beginning to drift past the windows of the penthouse when the silence was broken by the sharp, healthy cry of a new life. In the private medical suite, under the glow of soft amber lights, the contract of blood finally reached its conclusion. But as Dae-Hyun sat on the edge of the bed, holding a tiny swaddled bundle with a tuft of dark hair, the cold logic of the syndicate seemed a lifetime away. Elise lay against the pillows, her face flushed and exhausted, watching the man who had once been her greatest fear weep silently as he touched the infant's hand. The child, a girl they named Mina, was a perfect fusion of them both. Elise's soft features and Dae-Hyun's fierce, unwavering eyes. "She's beautiful," Dae-Hyun whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that no longer needed a mask. He leaned over, placing the baby in Elise's arms before reaching into the inner pocket of his charcoal vest. He pulled out the black leather folder, the contract Elise had signed with a trembling hand months ago. Without a word, he tore the heavy parchment down the middle, then again, until the legal terms of their arrangement were nothing but white scraps on the marble floor. "There is no more contract, Elise," he said, taking her hand and kissing the diamond band that had once felt like a shackle. "There is no more 1 year. You aren't here because of a deal, and you aren't here because of threat. You are here because you are the heart of this family. If you want to leave, if you want to take her and go back to Paris, I will provide everything. But if you stay..." He trailed off, looking out at the city lights. "If you stay, you aren't just my wife. You are the empress of the Seo syndicate. My men will answer to you. My enemies will fear you. You will never have to be invisible again." Elise looked down at her daughter, then back at the man who had raised a city to save her. The girl who had scrubbed floors and ducked her head in hallways was gone, replaced by a woman who had faced vipers and chemical fire to protect what was hers. She realized that power wasn't about the money or the guards. It was about the person you chose to stand beside in the dark. "I'm not going back to Paris," Elise said, her voice steady and resonant. "Paris was where I hid. Seoul is where I found my strength." She reached out, pulling Dae-Hyun down until his forehead rested against hers. The transformation was complete. The Parisian cleaner had vanished, and in her place sat the most powerful woman in Seoul, a queen who had earned her throne through resilience and a love that had survived the shadows. As the sun rose over the Han River, the ghost of Seoul and his empress stood together by the window, their daughter held between them. The world outside was still dangerous, filled with rivals and secrets, but for the first time, Elise didn't feel like a guest in a cage. She was the one holding the keys. The war wasn't over, but as she looked at Dae-Hyun's protective gaze, she knew that together, they would make the world bow to the name they had built from the ashes of a single forbidden night. "So here's what I need to know. When exactly did you realize they were always meant to end up together? Drop a comment and let me know. If you're still breathing after that finale, hit subscribe because I've got more twisted romances coming your way. And one last thing, what city are you in right now? I want to know how far this story traveled."